They called it the Gibraltar of the Pacific, a fortress so powerful, so heavily armed, and so strategically placed that Japan believed it could never fall. But in 1944, as the Pacific War turned against them, Rabaul became something else. A trap, a prison, a slow-motion death sentence for more than 100,000 Japanese soldiers. This is the story of how one of the strongest military bases on Earth became a place where men starved, broke, and vanished. Not because of bullets or bombs, but because the world outside simply left them there to die. This is Rabaul. To understand the nightmare that followed, we must start with the dream that preceded it. When Japanese planners looked at the map of the South Pacific in 1941, one location glowed with strategic perfection: Rabaul, at the northeastern tip of New Britain Island. Volcanoes ringed the harbor like a natural shield. The bay was deep, calm, and protected, ideal for Japan's massive warships. Surrounding hills offered endless space for bunkers, tunnels, artillery nests, fuel depots, airfields, and Japan built them all. At its peak, Rabaul became home to 5 major airfields, hundreds of anti-aircraft guns, 200,000 Japanese military personnel over time, thousands of tons of supplies in underground tunnels, a labyrinth of bunkers carved into volcanic rock. American generals looked at Rabaul and saw a monster. A direct assault would cost tens of thousands of Allied lives. Even MacArthur feared it. Even Nimitz hesitated. So they found a different solution. It was Admiral Halsey who first said the words that changed everything. "Rabaul? We won't invade it. We'll smother it." And that was exactly what they did. By late 1943, American and Australian forces began capturing islands surrounding Rabaul: Green Island, Bougainville, New Georgia, the Solomons. Each capture tightened the ring around Japan's giant fortress. Then came the brutal air raids. Wave after wave of Allied aircraft, B-24 Liberators, B-25 Mitchells, Corsairs, Hellcats, pounded Rabaul day after day. Oil tanks erupted, runways cracked apart, artillery positions collapsed, ships burned in the harbor. But here is the most important part. The Allies never attacked Rabaul directly. They simply cut it off, completely. Every supply ship sent toward the base was sunk. Every attempt to evacuate troops was intercepted. No food, no medicine, no ammunition, no reinforcements. A fortress becomes meaningless without a connection to the outside world. By early 1944, Japan's most powerful base had become a sealed tomb. Inside it were more than 100,000 Japanese soldiers. Infantry, pilots, sailors, repair crews, engineers, all trapped. And that's when the real suffering began. Japanese high command refused to admit defeat. Even as their soldiers begged for extraction, Tokyo sent back chilling orders. Rabaul must hold. No retreat, no surrender. But hold with what? There was no fuel. Most aircraft were grounded and rusting. Ships lay half-sunk in Simpson Harbor. Soldiers scavenged coconut shells for water. Hunger gnawed through the ranks like a silent enemy stronger than any American bombing raid. Food rations dropped to 500 calories a day. Then 300. Then almost nothing. Some men collapsed while digging trenches. Others fainted during guard duty. Many simply disappeared into the rainforest, trying to hunt anything that moved. Rats, lizards, insects. One Japanese officer later wrote in his diary, "We no longer feared the Americans. We feared the sun rising because it meant another day to survive." Disease tore through the weakened troops. Malaria, dysentery, dengue fever. Volcanic ash poisoned the water. But above all, starvation became the great killer. Rabaul, once a symbol of Japanese might, had become an island-sized coffin. And Tokyo could only watch as the fortress they had declared invincible crumbled from the inside out. The worst was yet to come. Because the final phase of this story is where despair turned into something far darker. The year was 1943, And while the world watched titanic armies collide across Europe, Africa, and the Pacific, a different kind of war unfolded in the shadows. A war without headlines, a war without glory, a war fought against hunger, disease, and the crushing weight of isolation. Rabaul, once a brilliant jewel of Japanese strategy, had turned into a silent tomb. It was not destroyed by bombs, it was smothered. The Americans called it island bypassing. Why fight 100,000 hardened soldiers head-on when you could simply lock the fortress and throw away the key? Rabaul's airfields were cratered, its supply convoys sunk, and its ships torn apart by air superiority the Japanese could no longer challenge. For the soldiers trapped inside the steaming jungles and black volcanic cliffs, life became a slow countdown. Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura, the commander of this massive garrison, knew exactly what was coming. He stood inside his underground bunker, once a symbol of power, now a bunker of despair, surrounded by maps that no longer mattered. Every line of supply, gone. Every piece of reinforcement, impossible. Every message from Tokyo, empty. "Hold Rabaul," the high command demanded. But hold it with what? The last ship had arrived months earlier, carrying more wounded than ammunition. Since then, Imamura's soldiers had been surviving on half rations, then quarter rations, and finally, whatever the jungle refused to kill them for touching. One diary belonging to a Japanese medic describes it like this: "We looked at the forest not as land, but as a prison. Every fruit might be poison. Every stream might carry disease. Every step might take us closer to fever or madness. Malaria swept through the camps like a silent assassin. Dysentery followed, then beriberi, then starvation. By mid-1944, entire platoons could barely stand. Men who once marched for the emperor with iron discipline now struggled to walk even a few meters without collapsing. One young officer, Lieutenant Keiji Nakahara, kept a journal. Its pages would never reach Japan, but they survived the war tucked under volcanic ash. A man does not know starvation until he watches his friend chew grass with tears in his eyes. We are soldiers without a war. We are ghosts waiting to be buried. Another entry reads, "We used to fear bombs. Now we fear silence." Because silence meant the Americans were still ignoring them, still choosing to starve them out rather than engage, still letting nature do the killing. The Japanese soldiers of Rabaul were trained to die in glorious combat, not to waste away in a jungle cage. The psychological collapse was devastating. Some men refused to speak for days. Others stared blankly at the sea, imagining rescue ships that would never arrive. A few even begged their commanders for permission to attack, even if it meant certain death, just to feel like warriors again. But the order from Tokyo was clear. Rabaul must not fall. Hold at all costs. To them, holding meant dying heroically if needed. To the starving men, holding meant slowly fading from the world. As conditions worsened, an unofficial economy emerged. A single can of preserved meat carried the value of gold. A handful of rice could command obedience. Even a cigarette became a life-saving currency. Fighting broke out between units. Quiet, hidden fights that would never appear in war records. Not for territory, not for victory, but for food. Some men tried to fish along the coast, but American aircraft strafed any movement near open beaches. Others hunted in the jungle, only to fall victim to crocodiles, venomous snakes, and disease-carrying insects. The lucky ones returned with a few crabs or a handful of bananas. The unlucky ones never returned at all. And through all of this, General Imamura wrote message after message to Tokyo. Send supplies. Send medicine, send anything. But Japan itself was starving. There was nothing to send. By late 1944, the men finally understood the truth. They had not been ordered to hold Rabaul. They had been abandoned to die in it. Yet discipline remained. Japanese military doctrine did not allow surrender. And so they waited, day after day, month after month, year after year, hoping for orders that would never come. The fortress of Rabaul was no longer a bastion of power. It was a sealed tomb, and everyone inside knew it. Rabaul, once called the Gibraltar of the Pacific, had become something far more haunting. A place where time did not move forward. It only decayed. The year was now 1945. Across the world, empires were collapsing, generals were surrendering, and entire nations were reshaping themselves. But in the volcanic jungles of Rabaul, nothing changed. Because the men inside were no longer soldiers. They were survivors of a war that had moved on without them. Each morning began with the same ritual. A weak, sputtering bugle call. A roll call where half the men could barely stand. And the same impossible task. Endure. No battles, no reinforcements, no orders except survival. The jungles around Rabaul hummed with life. Birds, insects, the distant crash of waves. Yet inside the camps, life grew quieter by the week. A Japanese corporal described it like this. Some mornings we woke to find another man gone. He died not with a scream, not with a shot, but with the quiet acceptance of someone who no longer believed sunrise mattered. To be a soldier in Rabaul was to live inside a slow-motion disaster. A tragedy stretched so thin that hope evaporated. Eventually, the rations disappeared completely. Rice became memory. Salt became luxury. And meat, real meat, was a story told in whispers. Men boiled vines, they chewed on leather straps, they scraped moss from trees. They ate palm kernels until their gums bled. Some turned to the jungle's wild animals, rats, lizards, and even insects, to stay alive. A sergeant wrote, "When a rat ran through the tent at night, we no longer chased it away. We prayed it would return." Hunger is the greatest enemy a soldier can face. It eats away at strength, at discipline, at sanity. And in Rabaul, it ate everything. High above the starving men, the drone of American aircraft became a familiar reminder. We know you're down there, and we will not let you escape. American bombers flew overhead almost daily, not to destroy, but to remind, to keep Rabaul sealed, to ensure the fortress remained dead. They didn't need to land. They didn't need to fire. Their presence was enough to crush any hope of breakout, any hope of rescue. One pilot later said, "We didn't have to kill them. The jungle was doing that for us." And he was right. Rabaul was not defeated by the US military. It was defeated by starvation, disease, and silence. Yet, within this darkness, something surprising happened. The soldiers refused to let their identity collapse. Every night, groups gathered beneath makeshift lanterns, sometimes just fireflies trapped in jars, to sing old war songs, to share stories of home, to remind themselves that they were still men, not ghosts. Chaplains led prayers, officers still saluted. Men polished rusted rifles, knowing they'd never fire them again. Little gestures, finger-length pieces of bamboo carved into dice, shells tied together as tiny charms, hand-sewn cloth flags hidden in pockets, became symbols of resistance. Not resistance against the Allies, but resistance against despair. A private wrote in his diary, "We were dying, but we refused to die as animals." Deep inside the volcanic cliffs of Rabaul lay a complex of tunneling, kilometers of underground passageways carved by hand. These tunnels became the last sanctuary of the surviving soldiers. Inside them, the heat was suffocating. The air was stale. The walls wept moisture like tears. But they offered shelter from American aircraft, and from the crushing guilt of seeing their comrades collapse in the sun. Inside these tunnels, makeshift hospitals were set up. Doctors with no medicine treated patients with nothing but cloth and bamboo splints. Nurses and orderlies used coconut oil for antiseptic. Even the dying were comforted with dignity. One nurse recalled, "They would whisper apologies for needing help. Even in their final moments, they believed they were burdens. They bowed their heads as they faded. Then, in August 1945, a message crackled over the radio. At first, the soldiers thought they misheard it. "Japan has surrendered." The men froze. Some laughed in disbelief. Others fell to their knees. A few screamed, their voices echoing through the tunnels. They had endured 2 years of starvation, 2 years of isolation, 2 years of slow death, for a war that had already ended everywhere else. One officer whispered, "We stayed loyal, and our loyalty cost us everything." The soldiers of Rabaul were now the last men of an army that no longer existed, and the world had forgotten them. The war was over, but in Rabaul, the silence felt heavier than any explosion. For nearly 100,000 Japanese soldiers, the surrender was not a moment of relief. It was a moment of collapse, of identity, of purpose, of everything they had suffered to protect. The fortress they had endured for so long was now nothing more than a graveyard with a flagpole, and the men still alive inside it looked less like an army and more like shadows wandering a battlefield the world had already forgotten. When the final message came, it was simple: cease all resistance, await Allied instructions. But for the survivors of Rabaul, those words carried a weight heavier than any battlefield loss. Officers gathered their starving units and attempted to address them with dignity, but many could barely stand. General Imamura, commander of all Japanese forces in Rabaul, spoke softly. "You have suffered for Japan. You have endured the impossible. But the Emperor has spoken. Live, even if living brings shame." Some soldiers wept openly. Some stared blankly into the distance. A few collapsed to their knees, unable to accept that everything they suffered, every hunger pang, every burial, every day of endurance, had ended with surrender. One corporal whispered, "If we had died earlier, it would have meant something. Now our suffering has no home." When the first Allied units arrived at Rabaul, they were not met by resistance, but by silence. The Americans expected to find disciplined soldiers. Instead, they found hollow men, some wearing uniforms that hung off their bones like sheets, others barefoot, with bandaged feet wrapped in leaves. The American officers were stunned. They had imagined fierce jungle fighters. What they found were survivors of a human disaster. One U.S. Marine said, "I thought we'd meet warriors, but they looked like patients from a hospital the world abandoned." And yet, when asked to assemble, the Japanese soldiers stood in formation, spines straight, eyes forward, saluting an enemy they once vowed to destroy. It was dignity born not from strength, but from the last spark of identity they still carried. The surrender ceremony was not a battle, but it felt like one. Columns of Japanese soldiers, thousands at a time, marched slowly toward the Allied positions. Some limped, some had to be supported by their comrades. Many carried rifles, not as weapons, but as symbols of a past they were about to relinquish. One by one, they laid their weapons on the ground. Stacks of rifles, stacks of swords, stacks of helmets. A mountain of steel representing an empire now dissolved. A Japanese lieutenant removed his sword, bowed deeply, and whispered, "Forgive us for failing to die." To many soldiers raised in the code of Bushido, survival felt like a deeper wound than death. When Allied medical teams inspected the camps, they were horrified. Men weighing less than 90 pounds, soldiers with untreated malaria and dysentery, medical wards with no medicine, tunnels filled with makeshift graves, hundreds of diaries documenting slow starvation. One American doctor wrote, "Rabaul was not a fortress. It was a slow-motion extinction." The world had known about the battles of Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and Guadalcanal, but no one had witnessed the silent death of an entire army until now. As Allied ships arrived to transport the survivors back to Japan, something unexpected happened. Many soldiers hesitated to board, not out of fear, but out of shame. How do you return home when you no longer resemble the man who left? How do you face your family when hunger has carved your body into something unrecognizable? How do you walk back into society when your entire existence for years was endurance without purpose? A chaplain comforted one soldier who cried uncontrollably as he stepped onto a ship. The chaplain asked, "Are you afraid?" The soldier shook his head and whispered, "No, I simply don't know how to be alive anymore." As the ships pulled away, thousands of men stood at the railings and stared at Rabaul, the jungle that starved them, the fortress that trapped them, the graveyard that nearly swallowed them. For the first time in years, they were leaving. Some bowed, some saluted. Some turned their backs, refusing to honor the place that had destroyed so many of their brothers. In one diary found later, a soldier wrote, "We came here as warriors. We leave as memories." When these survivors finally reached Japan, they were not greeted with parades. They were not celebrated as heroes. Japan was in ruins, families were struggling to survive, and many people did not want to hear about the tragedy of a forgotten garrison half a world away. For decades, the story of Rabaul received little attention. There were no monuments, no grand books, no films, just the quiet testimony of the few who lived through it. But in their diaries, letters, and fading recollections, one truth remained constant. Rabaul was not a battle. It was a human catastrophe, hidden behind silence. The world remembers the famous battles, but history rarely honors the soldiers who die slowly, unseen, and unheard. Rabaul was their story, a story of endurance, a story of loyalty, a story of suffering the world never intended to witness. A story that reminds us, not all wars end with victory or defeat. Some end with survival. And survival, too, has a price.